And then we'll call out a particular bill for Prince George's County. This will be, I believe, the third year this is introduced, that would allow for graduated speed camera fines on Indian Head Highway, Maryland 210, in southern Prince George's County. There have been 93 road fatalities on this one road since 2007. 93 fatalities on one road. I believe it's 7.2-mile stretch. I saw that Ron Weiss is on the call. I don't know if you have anything to add. This will be introduced by Delegate Chris Valderrama, who represents a district in southern Prince George's, and it would institute much steeper fines based on the speed of the vehicle that has been caught by a speed camera. So again, enforcement is not going to make the roads safer directly. We want safer infrastructure, but enforcement, especially in the form of penalties that inflict a bit more pain, can only help.
Right now, it's a $40 fine, whether you're going 12 miles over the speed limit or you're going 50 miles over the speed limit, which does happen on that road. And so I think it's important to sort of send a signal to those drivers that the fine should be much greater, and hopefully the incentive to not speed is greater. I'll note that there are deadlines for testifying at these hearings. For the Prince George's County one, the deadline is tomorrow. I think for the Montgomery County one, it's Saturday. So if you're interested in submitting testimony, you should register before those deadlines.
Yes.
Ron, did you have something to add?
Yes, I called support.
Okay, we are quite happy, Peter, me, Callie, to discuss legislation with you if you want to send us a note. Easiest is to write advocacy@waba.org. And we do very much want to work with people in lobbying your own legislators, and then via the Bike Maryland Lobby Day and so on. And we'll train people to the extent we can. Al Carr has weighed in the chat about a loophole about speeders driving a rental car. So Al is a former legislator himself. And yeah, it's always a challenge to draft the legislation to cover the full intent of what you want to cover. So there you go. Why don't we continue on? And Delegate Waldstreicher should be joining us soon, I hope, and we'll be able to field questions for you. Peter, you already talked about the Bike Maryland Symposium. I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
I'm here, Seth.
Oh, you are,
Jeff.
Okay, so let's go back, and so I am very glad to introduce Senator Jeff Waldstreicher, who represents District 18 in Montgomery County, and who is the Vice President of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. And so we have suggested that he can talk about the 2025 legislative outlook, the very difficult state budget situation, about legislation that he is working on himself, and then field questions. And I'm going to stop the share so that you can be on the screen if you wish to. And Senator, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Seth. Thanks to Peter Gray for the invitation tonight. As we go full screen here, I see so many constituents in my legislative district, Allison, and of course my former colleague and good friend, Delegate Al Carr. So thank you all for being here, but special kudos to District 18 constituents who are joining us here this evening. My understanding is that earlier in this evening, there was a little bit about legislative procedure. I know everyone kind of thinks, from 11th grade, they know how a bill becomes a law, but the internal culture of Annapolis is very strange. And I've been there now going on 19 years, so I'm used to it by this point, but it wasn't so long ago that I was new, and I remember that feeling of not quite understanding the jargon and all the procedure. To the extent that tonight you are getting both procedural advice and substantive advice about the bills that will come in front of the legislature next session that you care deeply about. The procedural advice is actually the more important. because I think we're all on board with increasing safety in our community, bicycle safety, pedestrian safety, road safety, but it's really the nuance of the bills and the procedure by which they move through the process that is the more critical of the two sides. So for those of you for whom that is new stuff, look to good folks like Seth and Peter, Al, and Allison, folks who know the legislative process really well, because it is fairly unique and a little bit challenging. But once you master it, you feel kind of like a magician. You know, like, oh, I know how to pass bills now. And it really is a deeply empowering feeling once you understand all the kind of committee procedures and weird kind of cultural issues that occur in Annapolis. Let me start with a quick budget preview. It's not going to be pretty, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the bills that Seth referenced, as well as a couple other pieces of legislation. First, this will almost certainly be the hardest legislative session that I've had in those 19 years when it comes to our budget. So, and I went through the Great Recession, right? You know, after 2008, 2009, as the economy was cratering, and of course, Maryland and Montgomery County specifically get a lot of their revenue from the property tax, and that was all created. That was really difficult, and it was challenging. We had to make really difficult decisions about what to fund. My understanding from my colleagues who sit on the appropriations and budget and tax committees is that this is going to be even worse. And these structural issues are not coming from the recent election or the federal government. It's coming from a hole that we've really dug ourselves here in Annapolis. And so we're going to have to figure out a way out of it. That process is just beginning. So I don't have any like specific intel I can give you in terms of how the budget issue will be solved, but we know that it'll certainly be a combination that includes slowing down some of the investments that we're making. And I imagine that will include investments in roads, investment in bike infrastructure, investment in transit, all of those things. If it's new, it will almost certainly be delayed. If it's in process, for example, the Purple Line or some of the bike infrastructure that I know you guys care deeply about, it will likely continue to be funded. And so that includes a lot of stuff. The Baltimore Red Line, which is really important to a lot of folks in the Baltimore City region and that I support, that will likely get delayed. The American Legion Bridge will likely get delayed. So if it hasn't started yet, the likelihood of delay is very high. A lot of money for bike infrastructure and other traffic safety improvements that the county utilizes, and for those of you who live in municipalities, that your municipalities use, comes from the state. It's called transportation user money, and it flows directly from the state to the county or to the municipalities. But during the Great Recession, that was one of the first cuts we made. And looking back on that, that was a terrible mistake. My hope is that we don't repeat it. But for those who are looking at our budget situation, just know that last time the instinct was to go after this local money. And a lot of this local money is important resources for so many of the infrastructure issues that we care about. So I will fight that. But I'm pretty honest that these are going to be really difficult times and there are no easy solutions to our budget challenges. I keep in touch with Seth and Peter, and so don't consider this the only meeting. It's December. These decisions will get finalized in late March or early May. I believe the Senate is moving first on the budget this year, so please don't hesitate to check in with me. Seth and Peter both have my cell and my personal cell. Everyone here is welcome to use it, but there's not going to be radio silence, and then you'll get surprised in March, like, hey, there's all these cuts. My hope is to keep you apprised along the way. Let's talk about a couple big issues that will come before us. One was referenced earlier, which is this issue of graduated traffic fines. And I think this is one of the most important things we can do. Seth, you referenced it with regards to Prince George's County and Indian Head Highway, which is almost certainly one of the most deadly roads that's not officially a highway in Maryland. But there's also going to be a statewide bill, and Vaughn Stewart, who's been such a champion on bicycle issues in the House, and I are introducing it. I'm the sponsor on the Senate side. Many of you recall that a couple of years ago, there was a terrible crash in a work zone outside of Baltimore, and a number of people passed away in that accident. And under the leadership of Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, we last year implemented or passed and are now implementing legislation to have graduated fines in work zones. And as Seth indicated, what that means is the faster you go, the higher the fine. And at lower levels, it's a reasonable fine. At higher levels, where the speeding is outlandish and reckless and dangerous, the fines become punitive. And so that is only true in work zones. But what we realized is, hey, if this works in work zones, we can start to apply this statewide to other traffic cameras. It was important to me and to Vaughn that at the entry level ticket, which is at 12 miles per hour above the speed limit, that the fine remain the same. We didn't want anyone to think that we're jacking up fines designed to increase revenue or create a punitive situation. So people should not be going more than 12 miles per hour over the speed limits, but if they are, their fine will remain the same. But at higher levels, above 20, above 30, above 40, the fines start to get steeper, and they are tied directly to the work zone fines that we passed last session. And so, I think we have created new legislation that has intellectual consistency with what we did last year. And as you might have heard in the previous presentation, it's always easier to amend previous legislation than to introduce new legislation. And in fact, that takes us to the safety stop. I support the safety stop. I think it's the right thing to do. And I've seen data that so many of you have shown me that indicate that the safety stop is much safer. At the same time, it is a new idea. And as we talked about just a second ago with the fines, new ideas are much harder than extending ideas that have already been implemented. So the safety stop is, I think, a really heavy lift because it is counterintuitive and because it's an idea that hasn't been implemented in Maryland. I know it's been implemented in other states and has done so successfully. So I think the summary here, and I want to take your questions because listening is really the most important part of my job, is the budget is going to be dominant and it will be tough and it will impact the priorities that we have here. But even as we're doing that, we have the opportunity to make progress on road safety, on bicycle infrastructure, and on so many of the other important things that WABA values.
Maybe we can have people raise hands and then we'll call on you for your questions.
And to the extent that there are any questions from earlier that deal with kind of cultural issues, why do you do it like this with testimony? Or why do you only sit on one committee? I'm happy to answer those questions as well.
Well, in that regard, Jeff, can you say something about what the procedure is? I don't know if you know what it's going to be in the House, but in the Senate, is testimony only going to be in person, or will hearings be hybrid, like in front of your committee?
Yeah, so on the Senate side, I think in-person testimony is much preferred, but we allow for virtual testimony. If you are testifying virtually, you generally testify last in the procedure. And so I think there is strong advantages to coming in person. I know Annapolis is a challenge to get to. It's certainly a challenge to get to on bicycle. But I encourage in-person testimony. So by rule, virtual testimony is welcome. By culture, in-person testimony is more highly valued.
You have a question from Ron Weiss. Will your speed camera fine bill start fines at the current $40 or at $60?
I think whatever the current is, which I think is $40. And like I mentioned, I think it was important to the House sponsor and I both that the starting point remain the same, that people who are just a little bit over the speed limit can learn their lesson without a punitive speed limit. But it will escalate as the speed above the speed limit gets more extreme, 40 miles per hour above the speed limit, the fine will get more extreme.
So, well, let me ask you a question. How can people be effective advocates with you and with your colleagues to get attention to their bills, to get positive votes in committee? How can people be effective advocates?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Seth, for that question. So there are many ways to contact your legislator, but the most effective way is always to set up an in-person meeting, because in-person meetings show that you have taken time out of your schedule to make a sacrifice and either come to Annapolis or in your own community meet with your legislator. So in-person meetings, hey, Allison, sometimes says, hey, can we meet for over coffee, or can we talk for 10 minutes? Of course, I would love to. And that makes a really big difference. In-person testimony on the bills is important. And for the reason we described before. In general, written testimony that is not accompanied by oral testimony is not viewed as a powerful way to contact your legislator. And so if you submit written testimony through our system, it might get read. I work hard to read the testimony, but it can sometimes be overwhelming. And sometimes if a bill has a lot of testimony, or if we're just busy on other stuff, written testimony does not get read. If you write your legislator, using your own language is more powerful than using a form letter. So form letters I see and I read them, but I move through them quickly. But if an email starts, hey, Jeff, I met you when you knocked on my door and we talked about this, and your son goes to school with my daughter, and sometimes I see you at the 7-Eleven in Kensington, and here's what I think about the safety stop. That's going to be a lot more powerful than a form letter. So personal outreach is always going to be more powerful than generic outreach.
So I see Larry Solar has a question. Larry, you want to come on?
Yeah, thank you. Senator, thank you so much. I've seen you speak so many times on cycling issues. Really appreciate all your support. I wanted to ask you about a little bit more about the safety yield legislation that a number of us worked on last year. I appreciate your comments. I mean, one of the nice things about that bill is not a budget bill, so it's something that hopefully we can get done. My delegate, Mark Corman, got the bill through his committee, and it passed, I think, the House overwhelmingly last year. And I know that Senator Smith ran out of time in your committee last year. We've talked to him, and he seems very committed to pushing this bill this year. And I know we have you as a supporter. My new senator, Senator Love, has told me she's going to support the bill. So I wanted to ask, what more can we do to help you get that bill passed? Because now that that's the law in the District of Columbia, and those of us who are cycling in DC, it's a completely different experience and feels much safer than it does here when we cross the border to come to Maryland. Thank you.
Yep. So yeah, it's a really good question. Let me start with kind of the cultural side, and then I'll talk about that specific bill. So Delegate Chairman Corman is a fantastic human being, a fantastic legislator, and a great chairman. His committee is called the Environment and Transportation Committee. And so transportation is really core to what they do. And so many of the bills that you guys care about are really part of the core portfolio of his committee. On the Senate side, we have 2 fewer committees and a third of the members. And so the committee jurisdiction doesn't overlap directly with the House jurisdiction. And that's why I'm speaking to you tonight. I sit on the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which has jurisdiction over rules of the road. But it also has jurisdiction over some really weighty issues like criminal justice reform and juvenile sex abuse, and just a lot of very weighty issues, family law, divorce, things like that. And so, I don't know how to say this diplomatically. I'll just say it candidly. Sometimes, and it's not intentional, and it doesn't go to values, but sometimes the transportation part of our portfolio is kind of like a side issue to the core of what we do, is these kind of life and death issues that come before us. And so we definitely ran out of time on the safety yield, as often happens. But part of the reason we ran out of time in front of us that, for example, environment and transportation didn't have. That's not a criticism of us. It's not a criticism of them. It's just a structural difference. And so if you're wondering sometimes, like, how come we're not getting better purchase in front of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, I don't want you to think that your views are going unheard or that the values are not values that we share. It's just competing differently with other workload compared to how it's handled in the House or in some other. So I think that just going to the bill substantively or procedurally rather, I think we'll just get started a little bit earlier this year, and that will allow us to work hard to avoid what happened last year. And I don't know if the bill has been pre-filed this year, but the earlier we begin, the greater chance that we have in not coming into conflict with other legislation. Listen, the counterintuitiveness of the substance of the bill, I think we can get over. But I think you guys know, like, it does take an intellectual leap to get there. You guys were just talking about a bill you support to give economic penalties to drivers who run stop signs. The same people who get a $40 ticket for running the stop sign will see a bicyclist running that same stop sign, who will be doing so not only with no ticket, but completely legally under the bill that you've proposed. And that's not insurmountable to me. I just want to be clear-eyed for those of folks on my committee who may not be bicyclists, who may not represent urban areas where this is more of an issue compared to rural areas. That kind of intellectual dissonance, it can be challenging to get over. And so I just want to be honest about the challenges ahead on that.
Let's see, Sean, you asked about enforcement reciprocity. Do you want to state your question yourself?
Sure, thanks, Seth. Yeah, I was asking if, or I was going to ask if there's any additional enforcement coming for those scofflaws you often see screenshots of on Twitter, where, or maybe on Blue Sky now, but where all the fees associated with a license plate might total hundreds or thousands of dollars. Very often, Maryland license plates on the DC system, but it's not uncommon to see it here too. I'm curious if additional enforcement mechanisms are being created that can bring scofflaws to justice, and if there would be any interest or any potential momentum in establishing some sort of reciprocity with the district to to protect divided communities like Tacoma Park.
I think that's a really great question. It's funny that Delegate Al Carr is here with me. Delegate Al Carr was formerly the chair of the Federal Relations Joint Committee, and I was, I think, either before or just after Al, but also the chair of that. And then, and what that committee deals with actually is interstate compacts, and these things get signed and then they are renewed on a certain basis. And so this needs to be done by compact, but I'm actually pretty shocked that it hasn't been done before. I got not a traffic ticket, but a parking ticket in Washington, D.C. because I got confused by the signs. I almost certainly will never have to pay that parking ticket. There's no consequences for me not doing so. I will, of course, but vice versa for DC folks in Maryland. That doesn't make any sense. We should easily, for safety reasons, be able to enforce against DC residents who are speeding on our roads, and they should be able to enforce against Maryland residents who are speeding on their roads. So the procedural mechanism to do that is a compact. I think that probably has to be done between the governor and the mayor, or between the two governors if you want to include Virginia. But it should be an easy thing to do, and it's the right thing to do.
I see Allison has her hand up. Allison, you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for coming tonight. It's really great to get some insight into what a topic that we as advocates spend a lot of time discussing is written testimony worthwhile? Is in-person testimony more powerful? And I appreciate your candid words on that. I wonder if you could go a step further and tell us which parts of the state, being that I'm on the board of Bike Maryland, we're spending a lot of time with people all around the state. Which parts of the state do you think we could potentially activate? And what are some of the things that you hear your colleagues in other parts of Maryland say that are barriers to them understanding some of the laws that we are trying to pass here? Are there arguments that we can try to help make through their constituents? Are there differences in culture from county, from east to west of the state that you have noticed that you would like us to be aware of, that we can help you overcome in your work in the Senate? That's a really great question, Allison. So the answer is exactly kind of what we talked about earlier tonight, which is it takes a little front end work, but being perceived as and being actually strategic is not as hard as you might think. So my committee has 11 members. And so you'll start to get a feeling about, let's say, the safety yield, who supports it and who doesn't. Well, when you guys plan your testimony, if you're getting a sense that a member might be on the fence, having constituents from that member's district is the most useful. And so I appreciate what you're saying, Allison. Maybe it's like, hey, we need to hear more from rural areas of the state, less from Montgomery County, or more from this or that. But actually, it has less to do with urban-rural divides and more of where do the members represent. So Larry, no offense to you, but if Allison comes to testify, I'm going to listen a little more closely to Allison than to you, Larry. And Larry, when you come to testify, Sarah Love, who almost certainly is going to sit on my committee, will listen more closely to you. That's just basic kind of politics. And so I know WABA, is represented in Annapolis by a lobbyist, and that kind of front end work, like, hey, who do we have? So I have a member on my committee from Harford County. That front end work, like, who's our most active bicycle advocate from Harford County? Well, let's get that person to come testify. That goes a long way to kind of personalize your advocacy.
Are there any other questions for the senator? I see a hand raised. John Corrin.
Hi, Senator Waldstreicher. First, let me thank you for your support. I'll say
John.
Past, present, and future. We appreciate it. This is our year for bikes on sidewalks. But the topic of my question is budget. This group has historically put most of its energy into all the things we've just been talking about, traffic safety laws to try to change behavior, in some cases change infrastructure. But in a year like this, where the budget is under so much pressure, what else should we be doing? There have been years where we went to budget hearings for all of the MDOT modes. And this year it feels like maybe weighing in, not so much on the size of the pie, which is under so much pressure, but on how the pie is divvied up among modes. There's been some great comments in the chat here today about how the return on investment on bike and walk infrastructure is so much greater than on road infrastructure. Any guidance you have on how we can help shape the budget?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for those of you who haven't seen John testify in Annapolis, you should come down and watch John, because John is an expert at what he does. And indeed, we're going to pass bikes on sidewalks this year. That's my bill, and Dana Jones on the House side, although it's possible Dana Jones is coming to join us in the Senate side. So we'll need a new House sponsor. Shanika Henson may also be coming over, or maybe the alternative to come over from the Senate, just to give her a shout out as well. So John, kind of sticking with our theme here tonight, it's always stronger and easier to advocate on behalf of a project than it is on behalf of a theoretical funding. And so talking about a pot and say, here's our road safety pot, is not as effective or sexy or meaningful as talking about here are the projects that are currently in process that come out of that time. And then talking to the members who represent those areas where those projects are happening. It doesn't even have to be projects where the shovel is in the ground, where they're already building. It could be some future project, but just having that project's constituency advocate on its behalf. Here's why this bike lane is important to me. Here's why this park that's getting built is important to me. Here's why this path that's rail to trail is important to me. And so those kind of community-based activists who will benefit from these projects are going to be the most powerful advocates on its behalf.
Great, thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, particularly Jeff, who is my state senator, fortunately, for agreeing to join us tonight. I want everybody who's has a question that they think of after we're done here tonight to feel free to reach out to me, Peter at WABA.org, or to any of the other WABA staff to ask your questions. We will be sure to respond. I also want to tell people that there is a meeting that happens during the session pretty much every Monday night. If you are interested in joining that conversation, sort of the ins and outs, inside baseball of what's going on during the session, feel free to send me an email and let me know, and I will put my email in the chat so that everybody has it. But I thank everybody who came tonight.